Hello, my name is Cale Moffett. I live in Washington, and I'm a bit nervous about some of the things that I'm seeing in the United States right now. Something that specifically bothers me or concerns me is how a certain F word is being thrown around: fascism. It's become a kind of verbal hand grenade thrown by both the political right and the political left. Um, and it's being used in some problematic ways. For example, on Veterans Day 2023, President Trump seemed to have mistakenly equated communists and fascists when he said, "We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, that lie and steal and cheat on elections." Now, while communism and fascism look similar in the ways that they affected citizens and non-citizens. Um, Equating them is problematic. They are different. On the other hand, I've also heard um, protesters and activists label practically anything and everything that the political right says or does as fascist. Similarly, calling actions fascist that are more in line with traditional conservatism can be problematic because it can demonize people in ways that are unfair at best and could potentially invite harm at the worst. So I'm a bit uncomfortable with how that term has expanded. It has a very specific set of meanings and ideas tied up with it. And I'm concerned because when we use language indiscriminately, it begins to become meaningless. And when it becomes meaningless, then it can cause some harm to society and to individuals. Let me give you an example from when I was a high school teacher. I had students and even my own children would say this. Whenever they made a mistake or misremembered something, they would say, "Oops, I lied." Now, there's a big and meaningful difference between lying and making a mistake or misremembering something. And not understanding that difference can have negative consequences. I've seen people become very enraged, very upset when they use that term, "oops, I lied," and then they made a mistake and another person accused them of lying. "What, are you calling me a liar?" And I've seen those moments become quite tense and fiery. Right? Sometimes it's simply a case that somebody makes a mistake, or they misremember something, or other times plans had to be changed because of last minute circumstances or emergencies. Um, Knowing the difference between making a mistake and lying can have very real consequences when it comes to working together or building or maintaining relationships. When it comes to calling a person a Nazi or a fascist, it's important to have a good sense of the language we are using. We as individuals may not wish harm or violence on another person. However, we can't always control how others will hear our language. And if somebody else hears us calling someone fascist, that could be taken uh, as a kind of permission or allowance to cause harm or to persecute others. And so I'm very concerned about the way this word is being used. So, in line with this concern about this F word, fascism, I'm going to do some vlog posts to try to help flesh this term out to help us kind of create an understanding of this. Let me start off by saying I'm not a professional political scientist or historian, but fascism is a topic I have considered for quite some time. I have an academic interest in Holocaust survivor narratives and have even presented papers at the International Holocaust Studies Conference held at the Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. If you're interested in the papers, I'll put some information in the description down below. So having done scholarly work on the Holocaust, I've had to understand and come to grips with fascism. So I'm not an expert, but I'm a reasonably informed person on this topic, and so I approach it that way. I think that the debates and struggles that we're having in America right now are incredibly meaningful, and they're good debates because they help kind of shape our 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 country, our experience together. Politically, uh, I do consider myself a progressive. I was raised in very conservative communities in Southern California and even voted Republican for quite a while, um, including voting for George H.W. Bush. Um, in my 20s, I lived in Germany for a couple of years and came to really appreciate Central European style democratic socialism. It's not a perfect system, of course, none are, but it embodies values that have become important to me. So I want you to understand that's the perspective I'm coming from. However, I do want to try to approach this topic fairly. So with that in mind, I'm going to be as objective as I can in these posts. Um, I just throwing this out there. I don't believe that complete objectivity exists. Each one of us brings with us in our encounters with the world, our experiences, and what has shaped us. And that in turn shapes how we see and view the world, which is always subjective. However, I think we can work towards um, a little bit less emotionally driven analysis, and I'm gonna strive for that. Um, I'll try to be reasonable as I present aspects of fascism and why others, including myself, do see it as a threat. I believe that right now, America has taken a distinctly authoritarian turn. Um, it would be a stretch to say that we're fascist as of right now, February 2026. But I think that some politicians and members of the administration, and even members of the legal community, may be working towards that, and we find some evidence of that. I hope my comments can clarify the terms of this debate. It's an important one, again, because it concerns our future together, and that is important. If you'd like my content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'm doing this in the context of other roles that I play. I'm not going to try to become um, a regular influencer and things like that. So I can't promise that how frequently I'll post, but I'm committed to this idea of putting some ideas out there, and hopefully they can um, find some purchase with others. Anyway, I'm going to start with the overarching concept of authoritarianism, or what in my mind, I call the umbrella of authoritarianism, under which we can find many different oppressive forms of governments, like uh, fascism, Soviet-style communism, Chinese communism, etc. Thank you very much. Quick little postscript here. I do script out my presentations when I try to speak uh, spontaneously. I tend to stumble over my words a lot. So I hope that doesn't come across as insincere or anything. It's just I'm trying to respect your time. Take care.